My name is Phillip Caveney. I'm with the Knysna Historical Society, have been for nearly 10 years now. We came down to Knysna in 2006 to retire, and since then I've been actively involved in historical matters relating to Knysna. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Knysna, starting with the early Dutch settlers. The first settler to settle in the Knysna area was Stephanus Josias de Blanche, and he settled at a farm called Melkote Kraal in 1770. Melkote Kraal was a vast farm. It stretched from the Knysna East Head all the way to Long Street in Knysna, so all along the east bank of the Knysna Lagoon. There was another settler here at the same time, or shortly afterwards, in 1778, and his name was Hendrik Barnard, and he farmed on the farm Uitzicht, which we know better today as Belvedere. So we had the two farmers on either side of the lagoon, both Dutch farmers, and today there's many Barnards and many de Blanche people in the Knysna area. In 1878, the Dutch commander of the Cape Garrison, the Cape Fort Garrison, by the name of Robert Jacob Gordon, visited Knysna, and he drew, or his artist drew, a painting of the Knysna Lagoon. And on this painting, which there's a copy hanging in the Knysna Maritime Museum, you can clearly see the two farms and the agricultural land, the land cleared. So those were the two farms at about 1778. Stephanus de Blanche also owned a neighbouring farm called Belbedacht. Now Belbedacht today is known as Eastford, but you'll see the Belbedacht turn off if you drive along the Lagoon Road. It's further towards George. Stephanus de Blanche died in 1794, and his widow, Hester Marx, continued to farm the farm with her children until she remarried a Johann van Lindebaum in 1798. Lindebaum sold the farm in 1801 to a chap by the name of Richard Holliday, and he in turn, well, he didn't in turn sell it, he died, and it was sold out of his estate a few years later. There was a rather brutal massacre of Dutch colonial farmers coming through from Richards Bay in 1802 at a place known as De Poort. De Poort is near Harkeville, and it's an area where the forests come together but leave an opening along a river. That's why it's called De Poort. And these farmers were escaping the violence which was happening at the time, and on their way through to Mossel Bay they were ambushed, and a few of the men were killed. This Lindebaum that I mentioned earlier wasn't killed, he escaped. So Lindebaum sold the farm to Richard Holliday, and Holliday then died. In 1884, peace returned and the colonists started to re-arrive. These were the British colonists now, because this is during the first British occupation of the Cape, and they got as far as Knysna, and one of them, a chap by the name of James Callender, who was a Scot, surveyed the Knysna estuary and the forests at the instruction of the Cape Colonial Governor of the time. And he reported back very favourably on the timber. He reported very favourably on the possibility of shipping the timber out through the heads, and this message got to a number of people in the Cape. And the person that heard it, that reacted to the information, was a chap by the name of George Rex. He was reputed to be royalty, but it was proved later he was not related to the royal family of England. He settled here in 1804. He purchased the farm out of the Holliday's estate, and came through with his entourage in 1904. He had previously been appointed as a notary public, which is an attorney in our language, at the Maritime Court, the Admiralty Court in the Cape, and was with them until he left them for various reasons. But what had happened in 1802, the English and the French, they had been fighting. England had occupied the Cape. The French and the English signed an agreement, a peace agreement called the Treaty of Amiens, and it lasted only a year. But what it meant was that all the British administrators in the Cape would leave and go back to England, and the Dutch would move back in, which they did do in 1803. The Dutch governor Janssens and de Mist came back in 1803. However, the peace was very short-lived, and the Dutch left and the British came back in again. In the meantime, George Rex had decided to stay in the Cape. He decided not to go back to England. He didn't have to, I think he may have had to swear allegiance to the Dutch rule, but he moved out of Cape Town and came across here. So that was 1804. The wealth that Callender had promised was mainly from timber. So when Rex bought the farm Melcote Kraal from the deceased estate of Richard Holliday, he also bought a farm, well, he took over a farm called Denonqua, which is known as Springfontein today. And Denonqua was just transferred at no cost because there was no developments. In those days you had a loan farm and you only bought the opstal or the improvements on the farm. You didn't buy the farm itself, that was loaned from the government. In 1816, George Rex extended his land holdings by obtaining loan rights to the farm Belbedacht, I mentioned earlier, which was renamed Eastford. And he eventually owned a lot of farms around here. He owned Melcote Kraal, which took us from the East Head to Long Street, Eastford, which took us from Long Street all the way to the Knysna River near the White Bridge, Sonkraal, which was later renamed Westford, which is on the west side of the river, Uitzicht, which is where Belvedere and Brenton are today, and half of the farm Leeuwenbosch, which we know today as Portland, and of course Denonqua, which is Springfield. So that was George Rex's portfolio of properties, and he was in a strong position to negotiate. And he negotiated with the naval authorities who were interested in Knysna as a harbour. He negotiated with them to relax their rules regarding the shoreline of the lagoon if he gave them a piece of land where they could build a village and a shipbuilding yard, which was called Melville. It was 40 morgen, which is about 40 hectares, a little bit smaller than 40 hectares. And in 1825, the British Royal Navy laid out the village of Melville. So you had the village of Melville on the west side of today's Knysna. Then what happened next? A chap by the name of Thomas Henry Duthie. He came out from the UK, from Britain. He was with the military forces, the 72nd Highlanders, and he married Caroline Rex, a daughter of George Rex. In 1834, he bought the farm Uitzicht from his father-in-law, who had renamed it Belvedere, and he located his farm on the west side of the Knysna estuary. He built himself a stone farmhouse in 1848, which today is the core of the Belvedere Manor Hotel, and he also built the rather quaint Norman-style church, stone church at Belvedere, which is known as the Holy Trinity Church, and it was consecrated in 1855, the same time as the little stone church in Knysna was consecrated. They were both conceived at the same time and both finished and consecrated at the same time. In 1839, George Rex died. Now, this was a bit of a dilemma because he had 15 children, and the farm, the estate had to be divided amongst the children equally. And not all wanted to be farmers. Some wanted to pursue other careers. So the family decided that they would try to retain the southerly half of the farm, which was, for those who live in Knysna, it's Vigilance Drive all the way through to the East Head. They wanted to retain that half, and the half from Vigilance Drive around to Long Street they would sell. But they also wanted to sell the other properties. So there was a lot of things going down. Thomas Henry Duthie bought the farm Sonkraal in Portland out of the George Rex estate. Portland in turn was sold to Henry Barrington in 1842, and this was a son of a Viscount. He was the 12th son of George V, Viscount Barrington, and he purchased the Portland farm from Duthie and built a stone farmhouse styled along the manor houses of England. The Great Fire of 1869 destroyed the house, melted all the silverware, it was total wreck, but he rebuilt the house again, and it still stands today. It's called Portland Manor today. Nothing much happened until a Lieutenant John Sutherland, who was an officer in the British Indian Army, was on furlough and holiday, on leave, and he came past the Cape from India, and he took a holiday here, and he came across to Knysna, liked what he saw, realised he could buy himself a very nice farm for a relatively good price, and he bought the northern half of the Malcote Kraal farm, which was from Vigilance Drive through to Long Street. And that's all he bought. He did buy some other farms. He actually bought, I'm not too sure now. Okay, let's just stay with that then. The half that the Rex the Rex family kept, the southern half, is known today by the farms or the names Hunter's Home, Rexford and West and Woodburn. Those are the three main components. Unfortunately, Colonel Sullivan died 2 years later, but his eldest son proceeded with the establishment of a village in Knysna, and this was called the village of New Haven, and it was on the east side of Long Street, and it includes things like the church morgan, the church morgan that Rex donated, as well as the Queen Street homes, that area. Excuse me. At this time in 1848, the population of Knysna, excluding the people living on the large farms outside of Knysna, the population was 10 adults and 5 children. That's in 1848, a very small population. But it had a school building, a stone school building built by John Sutherland Jr. in 1847, and that was the first school really that was built here. In 1855, there were 55 school children attending the class. At this time, the little Anglican St. George's Church, like it was in Belvedere, was consecrated. The first minister in Knysna was the Reverend Dr. William Andrews, and now at last the Knysna people no longer had to troop with their children all the way to George to have them baptized. Incidentally, the Dutch Reformed Church in Knysna was built in 1851. In 1858, that was a significant period for Knysna. It was when Knysna was declared as a magisterial district. Excuse me. Up until then, George was the centre, the land trustee of this area, and it stretched all the way to Uitenhage. It was a huge trustee or land trust area. It was broken up into 2 additional areas. So George remained George, and it stretched as far as the Huaga Kraal River near Swartvlei. And then Knysna picked up at Swartvlei and swinged right away to Blowkrans River, on the way to Storms River, on the way to Humansdorp, and the Humansdorp new district, the new magisterial district of Humansdorp, picked up at Blowkrans River and went all the way to PE, to Uitenhage. So 2 new magisterial districts were formed. Now, what that meant for Knysna was that they had to have a jail, they had to have a magistrate, they had to have a district surgeon, they had to have all sorts of services for the district. So the jail was built in 1858. It was built initially to house convicts, and these were convicts working on the roads under Thomas Bain. They did road work in Knysna, and they did the main road up to Uitenhage, up to Uniondale, what we call the R339 today. As also at the same time, the magistrate, James Fitchett, moved in, and a district surgeon was sent to Knysna. Knysna now became the new commercial area for the territory, the district, and merchants set up their trading enterprises. The St. George's Tavern was established in 1856, later renamed the Royal Hotel after Prince Alfred visited and slept there, and boarding houses were established. Also a large merchant store was established called Thomas Prince and Company. Now, what's interesting that these all live around one intersection, the intersection between Queen Street and Main Road. On the southwest corner, you've got the jail. On the northwest corner, you've got the church. On the northeast corner, you've got the hotel. And on the southeast corner, you've got the prison. So the people standing at the corner would start off with the hotel. It would be temptation, then condemnation, damnation, and salvation. Those are the nicknames of the 4 buildings. Magistrate Fitchett started a public reading room, the forerunner of the 1893 stone-built public library. In 1865, the brothers Peter and Johannes Mettelkamp arrived in Knysna, and they became merchants of Knysna, and Karl was the mayor, and they became major people here. In the 1870s, Knysna had 25 settler dwellings when the population had risen to 200. Also in early 1870, the Thiessen family arrived here, the Aunt and Matthias Thiessen, the 2 families, and they became very famous in Knysna. Certainly the younger son of Aunt Thiessen became the leading merchant and landowner in Knysna. He ran a trading store. He had a sawmill out at Brackenhill, which is about 10 kilometres towards Plett, and he had his own forests where he obtained the indigenous timbers, and he had a shipping company running between Knysna and the Cape. So he was quite an important fellow. By 1880, the population of Knysna was in excess of 1,000. Now, in 1878, gold was discovered on the Karatra River, which is near Reykjavik, when Jack Hooper found a gold nugget in amongst some grit he was getting out of the riverbed for his ostriches. It was identified as genuine gold, and that caused a bit of interest. A chap by the name of Osborne got involved, and he started scratching around in all the rivers. There had been an earlier prospecting exercise by a chap by the name of Dunn, and there was gold in a lot of the rivers here. And nothing happened because Osborne got relocated to the western side of Southern Africa, west coast, and he only came back 10 years later. But when he came back 10 years later, he immediately resumed his gold prospecting, and eventually in 1887 the Millwood area was proclaimed as a gold field. So we had a gold field. There was also a gold field at Prince Albert. There were a number of small gold fields. Ours didn't make much money, and by the 1900s it was defunct. The last arrival from the UK of significance in 1891, and that was George Parks, who established a sawmill. He bought a sawmill. He bought 2 sawmills, in fact, established a company called the Knysna Forest Company. He bought forests, private forests were available for sale, and he had his own private forest with indigenous trees, and that company still trades today as George Parks and Sons. If I can just dwell a little bit on the woodcutters and the agricultural immigrants. In 1879, the Cape government sought to attract agricultural immigrants into the Cape. And during the next few years, 125 men and their families, so 125 families, were settled in the Knysna district. They were allocated farm allotments, typically 20 hectare, and unfortunately these allocation of these allotments caused friction between the immigrants and the woodcutters, because the woodcutters had been given permission to settle in openings between the forests, and unbeknown to the people who surveyed the agricultural immigrants, they were there first. So now we had friction between the woodcutters and the agricultural immigrants, and it got quite nasty. There were a number of cases where people were beaten up. Nobody died, but they were beaten up, roughed up. So a commission of inquiry was established in 1881 to tour the area being from the Caimans River near George all the way through to Blowkrans, the Blowkrans River in the Tetsikama forests, and to identify all the woodcutters that were living in crown lands, state lands, to identify them, and then having identified them, to list them, to number them, basically a census, and then to allocate pieces of land, typically 10 morgen, some were 10 morgen, most were 2 morgen, which is about 4 acres. So the 1881 project was to first of all identify the number of woodcutters in the area. In 1882, another commission, the Commission on Crown Lands, came through, and they started surveying properties for the woodcutter families. They did out of 11 settlements that they identified, there were 11 settlements. Each settlement had typically 20 families in it. Of the 20 to 30 of the settlements they founded, of 11, 9 were established in 1882, but the remaining 2 were only settled in 1890. So the woodcutters were established in their own property. They had their own land. It was granted to them by deed. It registered in their names, and they then could, in the winter months, when the months when it wasn't suitable to fell timber because they were in seed and fruit, they could be growing crops on their own land to feed their families, because they were quite destitute. They were pretty poor people. By 1913, the number of woodcutters had grown to nearly 800 men and their sons, and this was putting increasing pressure on the health of the indigenous forests. As a result of that, the state registered all of the woodcutters on state land. Not all the woodcutters, but the woodcutters on state land. Registered them, they got given numbers, and that was the final registration. Nobody could enter the trade after that date. So in 1913, they capped the number of woodcutters, and the youngsters who normally would have been employed by their fathers had to seek employment elsewhere, which put further strain on the families. The 1913, 800 men, and the idea was, the hope was, that slowly but surely the number of woodcutters would diminish through natural attrition, through death and sickness, and eventually they'd get to a point where they could stop the damage to the forest. It happened faster than they thought, and by 1934 the number of woodcutters had been reduced to below 400 men. And what they then did in 1939, they deregistered the remaining 400 woodcutters, of which a third were probably old and infirm. They couldn't work as woodcutters anymore. Some were crippled. They put them into a village which they built for them at Karotra. You'll see the turn-off near Groenvlei when you drive back to Cape Town. That's the Karotra village. That was the village originally built for elderly and infirm woodcutters, and the balance of the woodcutters they employed directly into the forestry service. Thank you. That's my talk.